I know that we're in the middle of our story about Herb Brayman, but for a few days, we're going to move our episode with Thanksgiving stories to the front of the feed. It was recorded a few years ago, an omnibus of stories about the Disney studio and parks and Thanksgiving. So whether you're driving, flying, or just walking down the hall to reach your Thanksgiving dinner, I hope this episode makes it a little brighter. Enjoy! Today, we're starting with how Thanksgiving has been celebrated at the Disney studio and the parks for decades, from the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade to quiet traditions at Disney World to Walt's last Thanksgiving, and then to the story of pardoned turkeys that rode down Main Street as the featured guests of Disneyland, a story that has been expanded and updated since it first aired. Maybe I should also include this. The lore of American history has been a central part of the Disney experience from its start, from Davy Crockett to great moments with Mr. Lincoln to the American experience at Epcot. Today, we'll look at a handful of stories that explore how one of those Central American holidays, Thanksgiving, has been celebrated within the world of Disney for years. So, no matter where you are, driving home with the family turkey or suited up in sweats for a run before the big meal, set your cruise control to a comfortable speed or mark your pace on your Fitbit, and then settle into some quiet headspace as we dip down into a few stories from the past. Here we go. There are many ways in which Thanksgiving touches the history of the Disney studio. But let's begin with an artist named Tony Sarg and his unique contribution to the Disney Thanksgiving story. Tony Sarg, the son of German diplomats, went to school in England to become an illustrator. But as an adult, while working for magazines, he saw a marionette show and was mesmerized by the puppets. Though he wanted to see the inner workings of the show, the owners of the theater wouldn't allow him backstage. So, from the audience, with a sketchpad, over 4 dozen performances, he worked out the mechanics of the puppets to the point where he understood their construction and also understood ways to improve their movement. Once married, he moved with his wife to New York, where he gave marionette performances and built a touring production company that created spectacular shows with scenery, stage lighting, props, and ingeniously arranged puppets. On the road, his company performed Treasure Island, Rip Van Winkle, and Alice in Wonderland, a show that was particularly well received while it was featured at the Chicago World's Fair, where his production was viewed by over 3 million people. His puppets danced in large production numbers, juggled balls, and when holding a cigarette, exhaled actual smoke. As his company developed, Sarg remained in New York working on the construction of puppets and the arrangement of future productions, while others toured with the show. But his interest expanded out beyond the marionettes. He designed wallpaper and fabrics. In the early 1920s, he also worked with silent animation, creating stories with silhouette puppets, which were character cutouts that he animated with a stop-motion technique during the exact same years that Walt Disney learned about silhouette animation while working at an ad company in Kansas City. In 1924, Macy's department store in New York hired Sarg to create holiday window displays filled with puppet-like stages. That year, the first annual Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, then called the Christmas Parade, ended at Macy's, where Sarg's ingenious window displays were unveiled. For Sarg, the window displays proved so popular that 3 years later, in 1927, he suggested that Macy's add inverted marionettes to their annual parades, enormous balloons where puppeteers held the poles or cords below the figures rather than from above. His balloon creations were whimsical animals and humorous caricatures, though the first set of balloons did feature the animated character Felix the Cat. In 1927, the balloons were filled with oxygen and were essentially carried by teams of makeshift puppeteers down Broadway. The following year, for greater height and better crowd viewing, the balloons were filled with helium, and then they floated down the street tethered to groups of store employees below. Like many of Sarg's projects that relied on technology, art, and spectacle, the Macy's balloons were hugely popular additions to the yearly parade. The balloon entries expanded each year, and then, in 1934, during the Disney Studios' initial wave of popularity, Sarg contacted them in the hopes of including a Mickey Mouse balloon in that year's Thanksgiving Day parade. The mouse was designed by Sarg with a shiny star on its chest, the logo of the Macy's department store, but the rubberized silk balloon itself was fabricated in Akron, Ohio at the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company. By October, the enormous mouse was completed, then shipped all the way to Los Angeles, where during the first week of November, it was fully inflated at the Glendale Airfield a few miles from the Disney studio for Walt to approve in person. 3 weeks later, it was in New York, unpacked and ready to inflate for the parade. 40 feet tall, pie-eyed and smiling, a black and white Mickey Mouse, managed by 25 line leaders, for the first time moved down the streets of New York on Thanksgiving morning, followed by a smaller Pluto balloon. The image of the massive mouse towering over the crowd was featured in newsreels and newspapers around the world. After the parade, Tony Sarg would continue with his work on puppets and balloons. In the 1930s, he used mechanics to animate his show displays in Macy's windows, similar to early shows later developed for Disneyland. Though the paths of Tony Sarg and Walt Disney wouldn't cross in meaningful ways after the Mickey Mouse balloon, Sarg would train the next generation of puppeteers in New York, who, in turn, would train people like Jim Henson, who would later find a life in the Walt Disney Company. Three years after, Mickey first appeared in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. In fall of 1937, the Disney studio, moving away from cartoons, was then focused on the release of its first feature, Snow White. PR activity leading up to the release was substantial. Disney had arranged with companies to create tie-in merchandise such as a tea set, paper dolls, and even a wind-up Dopey toy. The studio had contracted with magazines such as Good Housekeeping to include a comic strip series that would tie into the film. In theaters, Walt himself appeared in the film's trailer, which was shot in the low-light environment of his actual office, where he explained the unique ambitions of his first feature. But by the third week of November, the film itself wasn't finished. The final cells weren't inked or painted, and entire scenes hadn't yet been filmed. For many Disney artists and technicians who'd spent years working on this feature, that Thanksgiving was spent at the studio where they focused in together on the film. Robert Cook recalled coming to the Hyperion studio and working alongside others, even though most everyone else in town had the day off. Quote, "We worked Thanksgiving Day," he said, and director Dave Hand sent out for a turkey, and we had our Thanksgiving dinner on the soundstage. 2 days after Thanksgiving, on Saturday, November 27th, the final cells were passed through ink and paint. The following Wednesday, December 1st, those images were finally filmed. 5 days later, the studio secretly premiered the film at Fox Pomona, a big theater in a little town east of Los Angeles. To record the reaction of the audience, Walt directed girls from his steno pool to, quote, "sit upstairs and one downstairs, and take notes on the stenotype machine about when the laughs came and when they ended." The crowd believed that they were seeing a romantic comedy, but instead would see a rough cut of Walt Disney's first feature. A film whose art wasn't even finished 10 days earlier, as artists and technicians spent their Thanksgiving not around a family table, but instead working on a film that families would watch on many holidays yet to come. Thanksgiving stories also circle around the parks going back to their early days. In 1959, Disneyland held its first large Thanksgiving event. For 4 days, from Thursday, November 26th to Sunday, the 29th, the park transformed Frontierland from a 19th century Western outpost to the stage for a 17th century banquet at the Plantation Restaurant. The Plantation Restaurant was one of the nicest establishments in the park in the 1950s, located roughly where the Haunted Mansion now stands, with its specialty being fried chicken. But for Thanksgiving, the waitstaff dressed in pilgrim costumes to serve a traditional turkey dinner from noon until 5 p.m. with the park closing at 7. The surrounding area was more deeply dressed than usual as a Native American settlement, with Native American elements arranged throughout Frontierland. In addition, the cast of the Disney TV show Zorro offered a parade and stunt show arranged around the Golden Horseshoe Saloon, with gunplay atop the buildings and a sword fight on the upper decks of the Mark Twain. The cast of the in-park extravaganza featured the star of the TV show, Guy Williams, but for the more exciting sequences of the performance, a stunt double played the role of Zorro as well, though with the wide black mask, no one really noticed. Out in Florida, Thanksgiving always holds a special meaning for the longtime managers of the resort. Back in 1971, as managers worked to prepare the Magic Kingdom for its grand opening on October 1st, they saw reports in papers that thousands and thousands were expected to attend the first day. One paper even estimated as many as 100,000 people, a crazy figure, would soon descend on Disney World. But as they moved toward that opening date, the company floated a more modest attendance range for the press. Specifically, they said, quote, 20,000 to 30,000 or more visitors each day, perhaps slightly less on the first day as construction wrapped up. But the first official day of operation was a disappointment. The Magic Kingdom was not visited by 30,000 or 20,000, but by roughly 8,000 visitors. It wasn't even a modest crowd. The official number was just over 10,000 people, but to get to that number, Executive Dick Nunis would later explain, quote, "We had to count all the comps coming through the back gate, as it would have been a public embarrassment to post a number below 5 digits. The turnout was particularly disappointing to Roy Disney, who had spent the last 4 years focused on the project, trying to fulfill his brother's final dream. Quote, Roy, Dick Nunis recalled, was really livid about it. To regroup, Roy Disney called a meeting with park executives, including Card Walker, Jack Lindquist, and Dick Nunis. After Roy let off steam about how the attendance numbers would hurt the company's stock price, Nunis ventured, "Sir, with all due respect, everyone in this room was there on opening day at Disneyland in 1955. It was a total and absolute disaster. Here's what we're projecting. The day after Thanksgiving, we will have to close ticket sales before noon." 3 days after this meeting, Baker Weeks & Company, a research brokerage, issued a sell recommendation after reviewing attendance patterns that they deemed, quote, a disappointment. Their numbers, amazingly accurate, estimated that Disney had received 10,000 on its opening day, 11,000 on Saturday, and 14,000 on Sunday, far below Disney's estimate of 20 to 30,000 or more per day. With this, the stock price lost $10 in a single day, ending at $99.50 per share, even though the larger stock market was rising. In the papers, the bad news, or at least the perception of bad news, continued, with reporters noting that attendance during the week was lower than the weekend, though none of the papers were given firm attendance numbers by Disney. Quote, "A relatively light crowd showed up at Walt Disney World today," one reporter observed when visiting the park on that first Monday. This trend continued for the remainder of the week. 10 days later, the Disney stock price was down to $95, a nearly 20% drop compared to its mid-September price. Charlie Ridgway, lead publicist for Disney World, remembers the situation clearly. Quote, "Walt's brother Roy told associates, 'Unless we have a full house for Thanksgiving weekend, we're in trouble.'" Concerned executives sweated out the opening ceremonies at the end of October and many slow weekends at the start of November. But then, highway reports indicated that a large number of cars were moving south toward Florida. The large crowds didn't arrive until the day after Thanksgiving. But when they arrived, they were huge. Cars blocked traffic on roads leading into the park. Hotels were booked to capacity. For worried executives, it was the best Thanksgiving ever. On the day after Thanksgiving, tickets sold out so quickly that sales stopped at 10 a.m. Quote, "We backed up traffic on I-4 into Orlando," manager Bob Matheson recalls. "We had to close the park, but people didn't leave. They pulled along the side of the road and camped until we reopened." Nunes wanted to call Roy Disney in California immediately after they'd shuttered the ticket booths for the day, but he realized that Roy was likely still in bed. He waited until noon to call, 9 a.m. in California, to share this good news. When Roy was on the phone, Nunes said, "Sir, I just want you to know we closed at 10 o'clock today." "Really?" Roy said. "You're kidding." "No, sir," Nunes replied. 10 o'clock. Even after its first year, Thanksgiving remained somewhat of a special occasion in Florida. For years, managers reminisced about that first Thanksgiving, with the miracle of cars lined up down entry roads as far as they could see. But the parks also have stories that connect to the larger meaning of Thanksgiving. A more recent Thanksgiving story involves a long-standing public-produced exhibit of sorts on Disney World property. Starting in the 1980s, a group of 20 families together booked sites in the Creekside Meadow section of the Fort Wilderness Campground at Disney World, where they erected teepees in the style of Native American structures, complete with beadwork sewn in patterns that evoked Cheyenne and Sioux designs. I should point out that this tradition appears to have grown out of the Boy Scouts with its exploration of Native American culture, history, and mythology, rather than a group comprised of individuals of Native descent. But it was done with serious intent as a way of reminding resort visitors of the largeness and complexities of our country's past. For decades, as some campers in Fort Wilderness set up holiday light displays and inflatable Disney characters around their RVs, another group, using poles and canvas dyed to resemble animal skins, set up dwellings reminiscent of those once used across the continent. For the big meal, the Disney Resort provided a pit for the group to cook their turkeys in time for a 3 p.m. feast. Quote, "We created an oven with tinfoil where we ground roast our turkeys using charcoal," one of the leaders explained in 2008. "Depending on the number of families, we'll have 10 to 15 turkeys." But the main Thanksgiving story I want to focus on in this episode isn't centered on the early studio or Disney World. It has more to do with how two turkeys made their way to Disneyland, a story that in its popular telling often points to the life of Abraham Lincoln, but that I think is a bit of a misnomer. The first Thanksgiving, of course, refers to a meal attended by Native Americans and European pilgrims in October 1621 after their first harvest. George Washington, the first American president, proclaimed a day of Thanksgiving on October 3, 1789. And from there, a day of Thanksgiving was celebrated on different days in different states as a local custom or a regional holiday. The first time that Thanksgiving was celebrated as a unified holiday was during the presidency of Abraham Lincoln. In a proclamation issued in October 1863, Lincoln said, quote, "I do therefore invite my fellow citizens in every part of the United States, and also those who are at sea and those who are sojourning in foreign lands, to set apart and observe the last Thursday of November next as a day of thanksgiving and praise. From there, at least in the northern states, the last Thursday became the day of the Thanksgiving holiday. And once the Civil War was over, the southern states joined in the custom. There's a popular story that for this first national Thanksgiving holiday, the Lincoln family was given a live turkey, an animal that Lincoln's son Tad quickly adopted as a pet and asked that its life be spared, thus supposedly beginning the custom of a president pardoning a turkey at Thanksgiving. But according to historian Gilbert King, though some details resonate with the historical record, the story of Tad and the turkey actually occurred during the long-standing holiday season leading up to Christmas, and not the far more recent national holiday of Thanksgiving. At this time, Tad was 11 years old, the only child living with the president, as his older brother was away at school. King describes the turkey incident in the following way. It was, however, in late 1863 when the Lincolns received a live turkey for the family to feast on at Christmas. Tad, ever fond of animals, quickly adopted the bird as a pet, naming him Jack, and teaching him to follow behind as he hiked around the White House grounds. On Christmas Eve, Lincoln told his son that the pet would no longer be a pet. Quote, "Jack was sent here to be killed and eaten for this very Christmas," he told Tad, who answered, "I can't help it. He's a good turkey, and I don't want him killed." The boy argued that the bird had every right to live, and as always, the president gave in to his son, writing a reprieve for the turkey on a card and handing it to Tad. In this story, then, the holiday turkey was spared, but just not at Thanksgiving. Another popular story suggests that Truman was the president who started the tradition of pardoning turkeys after he was presented one from the National Turkey Federation, a political organization promoting turkey farmers. Truman was the first president to be gifted a turkey from the Federation, though he likely ate it. When archivists at the Truman Library were asked for evidence to support this popular story about Truman, they could find no letters, articles, or photographs suggesting that Truman pardoned the turkey. Rather, they found photos of Truman eating turkey, at least at some Thanksgivings, while he lived in the White House. But from Truman's time forward, the National Turkey Federation, each year, gifted the current president with a live bird that was intended to be used for the Thanksgiving meal. President Kennedy was likely the first president to spare a Thanksgiving turkey. This turkey was presented to him on a table covered with a ceremonial dark cloth, with a sign looped around the turkey's neck pronouncing, "Good eating, Mr. President," thereby making the event into a photo op promoting the concerns of the National Turkey Federation. But instead of agreeing to eat it, after looking at the 55-pound bird with his white feathers and keen dark eyes, Kennedy announced, "We'll just let this one grow." An actual pardoning ceremony wouldn't become a custom with the American presidency until the late 1980s. On November 23, 1987, during an informal exchange with reporters, President Reagan was approached on two topics at roughly the same time. Some reporters asked Reagan, what was he going to do with the turkey he was given, while other reporters wanted to know if he planned to pardon Oliver North and John Poindexter, both of whom received convictions related to their involvement with the Iran-Contra affair. Reagan had already announced that he would send this turkey to a local petting zoo, but in making a joke he explained that he didn't yet know what he would do about North and Poindexter, but suggested that he would pardon the turkey. And from there, Reagan's successor, George H.W. Bush, formalized the pardoning event into a yearly ceremony. During the third week of November 1989, President Bush appeared before an audience that included school-aged children to receive the yearly bird, still given by the National Turkey Federation. Quote, "Let me assure you that this fine tom turkey, that he will not wind up on anyone's dinner table," the president said. "Not this guy. He's granted a presidential pardon." From there, over the years, the pardoned turkeys ended up at a petting zoo and local animal facilities often in Virginia. The birds from this period went to a small zoo in the Washington suburbs called Frying Pan Park, a working farm in northern Virginia where young guests could take tractor rides, visit an antique carousel, and observe how animals are cared for in a farm setting. The farm functioned, in part, as a living museum focused on the farm practices of the Depression era. But in the early 2000s, the animal rights group PETA began a letter-writing campaign suggesting that the pardoned turkeys were spared only to live the rest of their days at a Depression-style facility where they remained in 10-by-10 sheds without much activity. In February 2003, Bruce Frederick, head of PETA's outreach program, sent a letter to President Bush to explain that the turkeys he pardoned for the last 2 years were living in, quote, substandard conditions without adequate care. One would think that the two animals that had been pardoned by the leader of the free world could be given better accommodations, he said. Portions of this letter were reprinted in dozens of newspapers, mostly on the East Coast. The following month, Frying Pan Park promised to provide more straw for bedding, along with fruits and vegetables for the turkeys. The birds' quarters would also be heated during the winter, but the issue of Frying Pan Park was picked up in papers the following Thanksgiving and then the one after it. In 2005, thousands of miles away from Washington, D.C., out in sunny California, the Disneyland public relations team was struggling with a very different problem. They had been charged with the task of keeping Disneyland in the public's mind during the 18-month-long celebration for its 50th anniversary, arranged as the happiest homecoming on Earth. The celebration officially started in May with an elaborate press event, then progressed to the official July 17th anniversary of its opening date, with crowds lining up overnight to enter the park. But for the traditionally slow months in autumn, the PR team faced a challenge in turning national attention back to Disneyland. Toward the end of summer, while planning events for the coming months, Tim O'Day, the director of publicity for the resort, was having a working lunch at the ESPN Zone in downtown Disney to discuss possibilities to keep the excitement of the summer moving through the months ahead. His wife had recently told him that he should avoid red meat if possible, and so as he sat there with a turkey burger in his hand, he considered possible PR opportunities for the park when he noticed what he was eating. You know, he said, every year the president pardons a turkey. Around the table, people looked up at him, a little confused. Every year, he repeated, the president pardons a turkey. So what's that make the turkey? Again, those around him still weren't entirely sure where this conversation was going. If he's not Thanksgiving dinner, O'Day said, he's the happiest turkey on earth. At this point, everyone there saw the possibilities. After the meeting, people from Disney reached out to their connections in government, who explained that the White House didn't oversee the program. It was overseen by the National Turkey Federation. Disney officials then approached the National Turkey Federation, who saw that housing the pardoned turkeys at Disneyland, especially in light of that PETA letter-writing campaign, as a better option than Frying Pan Park. From there, the event found its own electricity in the press, that turkeys were going to fly in a plane across country to be the grand marshals in a Disneyland parade, only at that time Disneyland didn't have a Thanksgiving Day parade. Disney would instead create a Grand Marshal unit to lead the parade, which included a float with a see-through enclosure for the turkeys, as by this point, the Federation was donating 2 turkeys for the White House event. With only a 2-month lead time, teams across Disneyland, special events, publicity, entertainment, and so on, worked to assemble one of the most unusual events in the park's history. Over in Minnesota, James and Vicki Trites, who had been raising turkeys on their farm for Thanksgiving, separated out 30 toms into a special enclosure where they were hand-fed, regularly handled, and acclimated to people, as 2 of these birds would need to be comfortable when handled by the president and other guests. Out of that group, an official turkey to be pardoned was chosen, as was an alternate, which school-aged children around the country named by way of vote Marshmallow and Yam. On the 3rd week of November, James and Vicki Trites took the 2 birds to Washington, D.C. By now, they treated the birds as exotic pets, handling them regularly so they'd be ready for their presidential audience. Though in warmer years, the ceremony took place outdoors, on Tuesday, November 22nd, President George W. Bush stood in the Eisenhower Executive Office Building as James Trites, dressed in a dark suit and white shirt with pressed French cuffs, placed a 35-pound, 18-week-old turkey with white feathers named Marshmallow on a table covered with a dark blue cloth before the president. The alternate yam was kept outside the room. The president looked out over the audience, then said, "This year is going to be a little different. Marshmallow and Yam were a little skeptical about going to a place called Frying Pan Park. I don't blame them. So I'm proud to announce that Marshmallow and Yam will serve as honorary grand marshals at Disneyland's Thanksgiving Day Parade, and they'll go on to spend the rest of their natural lives at Disneyland." After the presentation, the president invited a group of children up to pet Marshmallow as photographers snapped shots. "The White House is called the People's House," Bush added, "and we're going to call Marshmallow and Yam the People's Turkeys." Once the event was over, the 2 birds received a police escort to the airport, where they were flown first class at Disney's expense along with the Trites to California. When they arrived, the birds were slowly acclimated to the environment of the park. On Thanksgiving, Marshmallow and Yam were loaded into the plexiglass enclosure atop the Grand Marshal's float backstage. As a truly unique Grand Marshal in an afternoon parade down Main Street, Marshmallow rode inside of a clear plexiglass enclosure on a float surrounded by 14 children in pilgrim costumes and a host of Disney characters, including Chicken Little. A sign across the float announced "The Happiest Turkey on Earth." From there, images of the parade showed up on the evening news. It was talked about on morning shows and The Tonight Show, becoming a cultural touchstone for the holiday season of 2005, one of the most successful publicity events in the history of the resort. And out at the park in the days after the parade, the 2 turkeys settled into a habitat in part of the Big Thunder Ranch section of Frontierland next to the Reindeer Roundup, with Disney intending to care for the birds for the remainder of their lives. A sign announced the birds as Marshmallow and Yam, the birds pardoned by the president. Even PETA appeared satisfied with this solution. Quote, "I don't suppose we could have asked for any better than Disneyland in Southern California," said Bruce Friedrich of PETA. "They'll have mental and physical stimulation, as well as proper care and a nice climate." For Disney, the event not only showed their support of animal rights, but also became a successful press event, with photos appearing in papers across the country and video clips continually appearing on the news. 2 years later, in 2007, the 2 turkeys, the official bird and the spare, didn't go to Disneyland, but rather to Walt Disney World in Florida. Just like at the California park, these 2 birds, May and Flower, served as grand marshals for a Thanksgiving Day parade, where afterward they were placed in a viewing habitat behind Mickey's house, and after the holiday season were transferred over to Disney's Animal Kingdom. The event also marked the 60th anniversary of the National Turkey Federation's gift of a bird to the president. This unique custom of sending the birds to Disney continued until 2009, which in terms of marketing was tremendously successful, with the President of the United States repeatedly mentioning Disneyland or Disney World in tones of generosity and warmth from the White House. The custom ended because the birds were so well taken care of at the Disney facilities after years of receiving them. The parks, both in California and Florida, decided they didn't need to add to their population of domesticated turkeys, as with care, they can each live up to 10 years. After 2009, the birds were given to Mount Vernon, the former home of George Washington, then Morven Park, then Virginia Tech. But the practice of Disney displaying birds as symbols of one of our national origin stories, that meal from way back in 1621, again solidified the identity of the Disney parks in California and Florida as places deeply connected to a popular presentation of American history and the customs of the American people. I'll be back in a few days with some more seasonal stories to keep us in a holiday mood. Until next time, this is Todd James Pierce.